Basic of web frameworks. In the last module, we have already tackled some of the jargon terms of system integration. Number 1, interface. 2, messages. 3, enterprise application integration. 4, electronic data interchange. 5, UN, EDIFACT. 6, XML. For the main lesson, why do we need to practice system integration and architecture in our system designing? Why? This question is often mentioned in different cases or problems, right? Why system integration? Can we proceed to the programming without studying system integration and architecture? This is a perennial question. If you want to write an application, no matter how big or small that project is, think of the design and its sustainability. There is a feasibility study for the project, the forecasting, and of course, the quality assurance. Nowadays, the programmers are using different platforms to create their prototypes. There are design teams, programmers, data scientists, analysts, monetize, specialists, digital brand, products, managers, etc. SIA plays a big role in computing. I am talking in line with computer science, engineering, information technology, and related forces. If you want to build an IT project, business, crowdfunding project, data science project, or whatever it is, the best part or the best full part of it is to design. When you design something, you do the hardest part. What is that? The thinking part is the hardest part of all. That is the starting point on how to kick off your project. It requires the basic steps of system integration and architecture. It requires planning and data gathering requirements. You are now in your second year level. Sigurado ang module na SIA ay para sa second year level. The SIA is your preparation to create and innovate the systematic steps. But there are elements that create detrimental behavior among us. Ano ba ang mga nagpa-sagabal sa atin? Ayaw natin bumasa, tamad tayong bumasa, try to appreciate reading. That is your best tool to earn lots of things in life. Our topic today is about web frameworks. Bakit my web, my platform, my Python, my Java, etc. And dinidiscuss sa SIA. System integration applies to all in business, management, ads, campaign, monetization, wellness, startups, and Internet of Things, marketing strategies, and much more. There are so many opportunities to apply for SIA. So what is a web framework? A web framework is a software framework designed to simplify your web development life. Frameworks exist to save you from having to reinvent the wheel and help elevate some of the overhead when you're building a new site. Frameworks exist to make building a website faster and easier. Typically, frameworks provide libraries and accessing of databases, managing sessions and cookies, creating templates to display your HTML, and in general promote the reuse of code. While the framework deals with many of the same issues and in some cases may make it very easy to build a content management system, a framework is much more general. Frameworks exist to make building a website faster and easier. Typically, frameworks provide tools to cover the common crude or create, read, update, and delete cases. Frameworks also promote the reuse of code. With a good framework, you only need to design for instance and contact form once. Nearly any site you're going to build will have to interact with a database. Frameworks generally often some means of doing so without having the delve into writing your own SQL every time you want to create, read, update, and delete a record. Most of the frameworks provide a ready-made template for the end user convenience. You can modify the header and the footer to be written once. Paano ka ba pipili ng framework? That's a good question, but a good place to start is to see if your favorite scripting language has a framework available. Kasi hindi lahat ng programming languages or PL mayroong web framework. The Ruby in Ruby on Rails refers to the fact that Rails is a Ruby framework. So if you're a Ruby fan, Rails might be the framework for you. But there are also Nitro and Merp. Python fans have a few choose from. Django is fast becoming the Python framework of choice. Or you can use the micro web service of Python just like Flask. But there are other options like Python and TurboGears. PHP lovers can check out Cake PHP, Symfony, and Zen. There are also Perl and Java frameworks for those that enjoy Perl or Java. However, just because there's a framework available in your favorite programming languages or language doesn't mean it's the ideal choice. Although none of these should be the sole criteria, each of these frameworks are noted to certain things. For instance, Ruby on Rails offers the light integration with JavaScript, making it a popular choice for Ajax-heavy sites. Ruby on Rails even includes the prototype JavaScript library, which you can integrate directly. There are literal dozens, if not hundreds, of more web frameworks in all sorts of programming languages, but there just isn't room to cover them all. If you are planning to kick off your IT project right now, you can choose among them. These popular web frameworks, what are those? So we have Spring, Java Server, Faces, also or Java, Node.js, Vue, Angular React, Ember, JavaScript, Ruby on Rails from your Ruby, Django plus Python, Symfony, PHP, Cake PHP, powered by PHP. Then also we have Zend, also from PHP, Nitro from Ruby, Merp from Ruby again, TurboGears from Python, Catalyst, Perl, Code, Igniter, PHP, Fusebox, Cold Fusion, Model Glue, Cold Fusion, and Mach2, Cold Fusion.
Hey, what's going on, guys? In this video I want to talk about the pros and cons of using a framework in web development, okay? And that includes UI frameworks as well as front-end and back-end frameworks. And just like with any video like this, take it with a grain of salt. It just comes from my own opinions, experiences, and research. So there's basically three types of frameworks in web development. You have UI or CSS frameworks like Bootstrap, Materialize, Bulma, You have front-end JavaScript frameworks like React, Vue, and Angular, and then you have back-end frameworks for just about any server-side language. So some examples would be Laravel for PHP, Express for Node, Django for Python. You also have Spring for Java, Ruby on Rails, you have .NET. So every language has frameworks. So we'll start off with some of the pros of using a UI framework like Bootstrap. So you definitely get faster development, faster UI development if you use something like Bootstrap rather than writing your own CSS styles. And what I really like about these frameworks is the prototyping aspect. So if you're focusing on a product, like for instance, I'm creating a Django course now where we're building a real estate app, and that's the focus. So using something like Bootstrap allows me to not have to spend so much time on the UI and writing CSS, custom CSS and stuff like that, and I can focus on the Django app. And it's like that in the real world too, not just with courses. You want to focus on your product, okay? Unless of course the UI is, even if the UI is really, really important, you can always switch that out later. You can always just throw Bootstrap on, get your product up and running, and then have someone or yourself go in and change the UI, okay? Mess with the CSS and customize it. So these frameworks are also responsive by default. The grid systems that they come with, they're mobile first, so they look good on mobile devices. You usually don't have to write your own media queries unless you're really customizing it. Another advantage is that some developers can't design for shit, so even some of the best programmers in the world, they can create anything, any kind of functionality using multiple languages, but they have no eye for design. It's kind of like a left brain, right brain thing. So these frameworks allow them to take their product that might be fantastic and make it look decent, okay? Even if they use just the default classes and don't customize the design, at least it looks better than, them trying to do it themselves if they can't, or just not having any style at all and having an application that looks like it's from 1999. So it helps in that aspect. Browser compatibility, of course, these are well tested in all of the modern browsers. Of course, if you're probably going to add some customization, so you'll have to test that stuff yourself, but the core classes should be fine in all browsers. Also familiar to other developers. So basically, I'm not going to say most. I don't know if most developers know Bootstrap, but many do. So they're going to recognize the classes. They're going to know what the navbar is. They're going to know what the card classes are, the margin and padding classes, stuff like that. So it's easier to work with a team if you're using a framework. Also, JavaScript widgets and plugins are usually available with these frameworks. So things like modals, what else? Carousels, collapsible menus, things like that. And then you have documentation and support. Most of the documentation for these frameworks are really good, and they have really good examples. And a lot of times you can just copy and paste and then just change it, to your liking. So let's look at some of the cons of these frameworks. Now, the first one is it's not really a con for the framework, it's just kind of an unfortunate side effect. So a lot of people will just learn the very basics of CSS and then start to use Bootstrap or something in all their projects. And when it comes time to actually customize an interface or create a custom HTML CSS theme, they're lost, and they don't know Flexbox or the grid or transition, stuff like that. So that's a kind of just an unfortunate side effect, because people jump to frameworks too quick, and that's not just with UI frameworks. I'll also talk about that with some of the other ones as well. But yeah, so you want to learn CSS before you start to jump into a framework. Less customization. So if you want your website to be really, really different as far as the UI, if that's something that's high priority, you're probably going to want to create your own interface, your own styling and stuff like that. If you're really good at UI and UX, maybe even think of creating your own framework, which I did a couple years ago. It wasn't too great, but that's something you might want to look into. A complaint that I see a lot is many of the sites look the same, and I agree with this to an extent. Like if you don't customize it enough, then yeah, they're, Bootstrap sites, you can kind of spot them a mile away if you're just using all the default classes with all the default colors. Everybody knows the primary and secondary colors and all that stuff. But you can customize it. But one of the disadvantages of customization is sometimes you override styles, and I really don't like to do that. It feels messy to kind of, override styles and have to put the important flag and stuff like that. What I would suggest is definitely downloading the source code and using Sass, okay? So, or whatever that framework uses. Bootstrap uses Sass. So you can just customize the variables file, and you can completely change the colors. You can change, the size of the buttons if you want rounded or straight corners. Just pretty much anything you can change in that variables file. And then you can go deeper and edit some of the other Sass files as well, and you can make it look, nothing like a Bootstrap theme. And then we also have dependence on jQuery in some of these frameworks. Materialize now with 1.0, I believe, you don't need jQuery anymore, that you can actually use vanilla JavaScript for the widgets. And then Bulma, I believe, doesn't even have JavaScript widgets, so there's no jQuery there. But, Bootstrap, you still do need jQuery. And hopefully they follow suit. Like what Materialize has done. Alright, so front-end JavaScript frameworks. Now, I want to make it clear that I'm not comparing, should you use, for a full-stack app, should you use, Laravel with Blade templating, comparing a template engine to building a back-end framework API, that serves JSON and then using a front-end framework. That's not what I'm comparing. I'm comparing building a front-end framework with something like React or building it with something with vanilla JavaScript. So when it comes to building large front-end applications, whether it's a full stack with a large front-end or just a front-end, it's much, much less work to use a framework, to use something like React or Angular or Vue than to use vanilla JavaScript to manipulate the DOM and, make all your fetch requests and stuff like that. Okay, it's also much more organized. You have a component-based design, so you can look at everything in your UI, in your application as a component, as a functioning component. You also have robust data and state management, okay? So all your components can have their own state. You can have application level state with something like Redux or something like Vuex or NGRX. There's plenty of state management tools out there. Fast performance, so you have some of the best developers in the world working on these frameworks, and performance and security, I would say, are always at the top, okay? So like with React, you have the virtual DOM, and it doesn't have to reload the whole page and stuff like that, so they're very fast. They're also very reliable and thoroughly tested, so, a lot of people use these frameworks and report bugs and stuff like that, and they're usually taken care of pretty quick. And of course you have a community around these frameworks, support, so you can easily get support. If you're doing everything custom, it's a lot harder to get help because they don't know the structure of your code, It's also great for teams. If everyone on your team knows React, then you're kind of already on the same page, excuse me, rather than having custom code that people have to kind of comb through and really try to understand what the hell's going on. Alright, so let's take a look at some of the cons or disadvantages of front-end frameworks. So I think that for smaller projects, they just add complexity and they're overkill. For example, like a lot of the vanilla JavaScript projects I do on my channel and in my modern JavaScript course, like let's say the speech app we just did, or the weather app, the loan calculation app, stuff like that, you really only need, one JavaScript file and you're just manipulating the DOM a little bit, taking some form input, maybe making a GET request with the fetch API and just returning the results. You don't need a framework for stuff like that. It just adds complexity to the application, and I think frameworks can be overused. So some of them are too opinionated, which gives you less freedom, so you have to do everything their way. I think Angular is probably the biggest culprit of this. There's not too much room or flexibility in Angular, which it can be a good thing because it provides structure. I think that React, on the other hand, is a little too unopinionated because you can do like you can do the same thing 100 different ways. Okay, and I really like both frameworks along with Vue, but those are just some of the, I don't know, some things that I think people might see as a negative. So they stopped beginners from learning actual JavaScript. Just like with the UI frameworks, people jump into frameworks too quick, and that's a mistake. You need to learn the fundamentals. I personally recommend learning all of ES6 before you jump into a framework. So you need to learn arrow functions, classes, destructuring, what else? The spread operator, constant let. All this stuff should be learned before you jump into React, Angular, or Vue, or some other framework. They can updates can introduce issues. This is a big problem because a lot of times they'll update the framework and it'll introduce breaking changes, so your application will no longer work. You'll have to go in and restructure the code and apply whatever the new syntax is or whatever. And this can be very frustrating. And it wouldn't be so bad if there weren't so many updates so often. It seems like just JavaScript has this issue. Like, I don't find this with backend frameworks like Laravel and Django and stuff like that, or even backend JavaScript like Express. It doesn't seem like they're updating things, every month, and that can be kind of frustrating. So I think that's looked at as a negative with JavaScript frameworks on the front end, at least. Alright, so backend framework. So this is like, Express, Laravel, Django, Ruby on Rails. These are backend or server-side frameworks. So these save a ton of time and make things much easier. And I think that out of the three categories, this is where frameworks save you the most. Because when you build backend applications from scratch, it's very difficult. You have to take into security into account, and it's just, there's not too many situations where I wouldn't use a framework for the back end. So they're very flexible and allow you to build almost anything. So no matter what language you're using or framework, most of the open source frameworks, you can build any type of application you want, whether it's e-commerce or social network, or real estate app like I'm doing in my Django course, or even just a regular website. Anything you want, you can build with most of these frameworks. Security is a huge concern on the server side, and many of these frameworks have really good security features built in. And if you built something from scratch, you would have to implement this stuff yourself, and it just wouldn't be as secure. You have teams of really good developers constantly working on these frameworks, and security is usually at the top of the list. So MVC stands for Model View Controller, and not all frameworks follow MVC to a T. Most of them don't, but they have some kind of implementation that relates to MVC, which gives your application structure. Okay, you have your controllers and routing, you have your models to work with your database, as well as, most frameworks have ORMs so that you don't have to write these long SQL queries by hand. You can use a much simpler syntax. And then, Vue for templating. So you have a template system, or if you're building, microservices with a backend framework, you can simply output JSON and use some kind of front-end framework like React or Angular to take that JSON and then, build the UI with the front end. So you also have built-in routing. I've built quite a few custom PHP applications, and routing always sucks. It seems easy at first, like to just do /about or whatever, but when you get into multiple levels, and when you get into underscores and dashes, and it becomes a mess. So built-in routing is definitely a perk of backend frameworks. And then, of course, community documentation and support for when you have an issue. I'm building my Django course app now, and I'd be lost without the documentation. If I want to know how to paginate, I can find that in minutes. Anything that I want to know about the framework and how I can do something, I can find either in the docs or on Stack Overflow. All right, so cons or disadvantages for using a backend framework. This is a tough one. I myself would probably never just about never build a large production application without a server-side framework. I think that it's kind of a dumb business decision unless those are the requirements from the company. You're adding so much time to your project, and you're going to lose a lot of money. These frameworks are built so that you can build just about anything with them. And you can also build your own framework, which I'll talk about in the conclusion. But again, just like with the UI frameworks and front end, they can stop beginners from learning the fundamentals of coding. I see a lot of people just jump right into Laravel or jump right into Django without learning PHP or Python. At least the fundamentals. You don't have to master it before jumping in, but at least know the basics. You should be able to write, use PDO or MySQLi and put something into a database with vanilla PHP before you jump into Laravel, because everything, like Laravel is a very high level framework. So you're not going to really know what's going on and how things actually work. Okay, so don't jump into frameworks too quick. Some frameworks can be too opinionated and people don't like that. I think Ruby on Rails is pretty opinionated, as well as Django. But I don't see that really as a bad thing necessarily, because it provides structure. But you have frameworks of all kinds. For instance, Flask, which is a Python framework, is very unopinionated. You can do things basically however you want. All right, but that's really all I have for cons for backend frameworks, because it's just so damn hard to create stuff from scratch, at least large applications. If you're building simple stuff, again, just like with the front end, you probably don't need a framework. If you're building obviously like a simple PHP website, you probably don't need a framework. But anything that has any kind of complexity to it, you probably want to use one. All right, so building a custom framework is something that I haven't really talked about, and that can be a really good idea, because what you can do is just build the things that you're going to use, because you might find that Laravel or something has too much crap that you're not going to be using, and it just adds bloat to your application. So if you are good enough to build your own framework that only provides what you need and make it very light, then that's great. There's nothing wrong with that at all. As long as you have the skills to do that, as long as you can make it secure and make it performant, then that's actually a really good idea. So in the end, I think it comes down to the developer, the project, and the client. Okay, and I know that on the internet, programmers like to one-up each other and say, "Oh, I wouldn't use a framework. I wouldn't use this or that. I build it from scratch." That's a real immature and just nerdy way of thinking. If you want to be successful, you need to get jobs done as quickly as possible in an efficient and practical way. And frameworks and other tools, they're designed for you to do that. Okay, so don't fall into that "I'm smarter than you" crap, because people like that, they may be able to code something better than you, or in a more customized way, but if you're pragmatic and you have better business sense and just common sense, you're going to be way more successful than that person. You're going to be working, and they're going to be in their mom's basement writing code that is completely unreadable by anyone else, because they wanted to look smarter than everyone. So just keep that in mind. Companies use frameworks because they have good business sense and they want to get things done as fast as possible. So take advantage of these tools. If you can build the tool yourself, then that's great as well. But just try to be practical in your code, and just in your career in general, and you'll get a lot further than trying to one-up everybody. Alright, so thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you liked this video. If you did, leave it a like, and I will see you next time.
So now that's the end of our content notes. So for the skill building, we have a separate discussion for this, as well as for checking for understanding. For the frequently asked questions, can I use web frameworks in system integration and architecture? The answer is, web frameworks is one tool to design a system. The SIA has principles about integration of the system. design management, production, cost, and sustainability. That's how this process works. Okay, so that's the end of our discussion. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a nice day.